But if you can't hear me in the back, raise your hand, and I apologize to the people sitting in the front row. You may go deaf as I show. I fly commercial a lot, but that doesn't qualify as an aviator, as you know. But when I first began coming to the village, like a lot of you, I began to explore the history of this part of the world and became fascinated when I found that, in fact, an aircraft came down not very far from what was then known as Pearson, Chihuahua. And it's that story that I'm going to develop with you, this history of the first Aero Squadron. Now, I want to acknowledge a number of people who have been involved in this. Spencer and Emmy and Walter. Many of you know Adalberto Perez, is known in the village as Profe. I want to especially acknowledge Pino, because a lot of this had to do with developing some facts and getting the signage straight along the railroad. And Pino was a very significant help. And Hector was involved early on as we began to search for this aircraft. And I'd like to acknowledge these people because they've been a great assistance during this time. This is a picture taken of Benjamin. Will this work? Can you hear me back there? Okay, can you hear me up here? Yes. All right. This is a picture of Benjamin Floyd, who was the first American aviator in what was known as the Aviation Company. This is, he's sitting in an aircraft known as the Wright Flyer. This was taken in 1909, and it's the first known photo of an American pilot. I need a third arm. Anybody got a third arm? A group of American aviators down there. Three planes, 3 pilots joined Benjamin Floyd in this endeavor. And these were the types of aircraft they were flying at the time. They flew in support of the maneuver division, but in May of 1911, the first casualty occurred. Lieutenant Kelly crash landed and was killed in the process. And the base commander at Fort Sam Houston actually called a halt to the flying program at that time. It didn't get reactivated until the following year. This is the individual who became the first commander of the Aero Squadron, San Diego, California, so there is a San Diego connection here. This is a picture of the first JN2s at the aviation school on North Island in San Diego. And this is from a collection of photographs of Vernon Verge that's now in the Airman Memorial Museum. And these aircraft are very different from the earlier ones. Rather than be a pusher, which had the propeller behind, they've got the propeller forward. Now, what happened with these JN2s was very significant. They were underpowered. When the Army tested them extensively, first in California and then at Fort Sill in Oklahoma in the summer of 1915, they found that they were underpowered, that they actually had more other unstable characteristics. At certain angles of attack, at 12, 14, and 15 degrees, they tended to roll over. And in fact, after 2 months of testing this aircraft, the JN2 pilots refused to fly it anymore. And so that led to the specifications for the JN3. Now the JN3s, or 2 of them arrived de novo as JN3s, but the existing JN2s were retrofitted in the field. So the JN2s actually never flew in combat. It's the JN3 that developed into the aircraft that we're going to talk about today. Back then, when planes had to go from one part of the country, they didn't fly from one part of the country. They were put on a railroad and transported. As problems heated up along the border, the airplanes were actually sent to Columbus, New Mexico, from their base in Fort Sam Houston near San Antonio. And this is how they arrived. This is a photo taken of the arrival of one of the aircraft in Columbus. They're transported off the plane, and in fact, when they're moved around, they're dragged around by trucks. And you can see the fuselage of number 53 without the wings having been attached with a propeller just yet. Now this is a picture taken in Columbus. This is Lieutenant Gorell of the 1st Aero Squadron. And I put this in here for a particular reason. I want you to look at this propeller. This is one of the unusual characteristics of this village, these interconnections we all seem to have. It is extremely likely that this propeller was manufactured by Spencer McCallum's grandfather, who owned a propeller-making factory at the time and had patents on these propellers. And it probably is true that all the propellers on the JN3s that flew out of Columbus down here into Mexico were made in Spencer's grandfather's factory. These are the kinds of planes that were present at the time. The big change in the JN3 from the JN2 was the extension of the wing. The upper and lower wings were both 30 feet wide in the JN2, which led to instability because it turned out the lower wing was providing no lift. In fact, more of a drag, which led to the rollover problem. So one of the solutions that Curtis came up with was to make the upper wing 10 feet longer. So it was a 40-foot wing over a 30-foot wing. But the difficulty is that these planes were suited to fly ideally at 6,000 feet, and if you only had one person in it, a maximum possibility of near 11,000 feet. Since we're nearly at 6,000 feet here and the mountains go up from here, you can see what the problems soon became. Now, what happened is that when Poncho Villa attacked Columbus, U.S. Congress and the President sent General Pershing into Mexico to chase after Villa as part of the Punitive Expedition. Now, he entered Mexico 8 days after Villa attacked Columbus, and 3 days after that, he called to the 1st Air Squadron and gave them orders to proceed as quickly as possible to his camp near Colonia Dublan. The difficulty is that the planes did not take off till 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Only one of the pilots of these 8 planes had ever flown at night previously. The other 7 pilots had no nighttime flying experience whatsoever, and that turned out to be a difficulty. This is a picture of the expedition. This is photos I took from the New York Times pictorial at the end of March of 1916. This is what it looked like when Pershing crossed the border with his troops. And this is an encampment here in Mexico at the time. You can see the rifles stacked up as in between, and soldiers taking rest wherever they could find it. Now, these are the names of the pilots that flew down, and it's the one second from the bottom that we're interested in. Lieutenant Robert Henry Willis. He flew one of the planes. What happened was that when they took off, 8 planes took off a little after 5 p.m. in the afternoon. One of them developed motor trouble immediately, turned around and came back and landed back in Columbus. The other 7 went south. The idea at the time was that they would all follow one another. The maps they had were inadequate for the tasks, and as one of the aviation historical journals indicated, that the compasses on these planes were remarkable for their unreliability. And so these pilots attempted to follow one another. Well, 4 of them were successful, but they got lost in the dark and actually landed at La Ascension. The 3 others separated completely. 2 landed safely at various other locations and were able to connect up with the other group the following day. However, Lieutenant Willis got lost, proceeded past Nuevo Casas Grandes, past Viejo Casas Grandes, and in fact put the plane down south of Pearson. Now, at the time, when he landed, he damaged the landing gear and the plane became inoperable. It was at night, and he crash landed by estimates a little after 8 p.m. What he did was to hike out at night and hide during the daytime from Villa's forces, and he arrived in Pershing's camp at 1 a.m. on the 21st of March with the information that in fact he had crash landed. That day, Pershing sent a truck to salvage what was left of the plane, but they were fired upon by rebels as they approached the plane and had to go back to Colonia Dublan. They returned the next day with additional forces and salvaged what they could. But Villa, by that time, his forces had practically destroyed the plane. The fuselage was in tatters, the wings had been destroyed. In fact, the description is that the only remaining element that could be seen was actually the engine. Now, through historical research, we were able to obtain archives from various military historical places, some in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and some in Alabama. And we have a description of a soldier who was on train when Pershing's forces on the 21st of March were headed south to after Villa. He noted that they stopped at a kilometer marker known as 282, and from the window of the train, he could actually see the plane. Now, what you'll see is Juan Mata Ortiz, known as Pearson back then, at the bottom of this. And in fact, on maps, which is interesting, El Ruscio would be down here, and Juan Martirez as Pearson didn't appear on maps at that time. Pearson didn't get developed as a village until 1910, and maps prior to that didn't even have Pearson on the map. Santa Rosa wasn't on the map. San Diego was, and interesting, El Ruscio was. So when the report of the soldier was that near Pearson, near kilometer marker 282, he saw the plane, that was when the first mystery really developed. When I mentioned to friends that a pilot with no skill flying at night had put a plane down after sunset, the first thing my pilot friends told me is that there would have to be a source of illumination to be able to visualize a horizon in order to land the plane. And they said, you should check the phase of the moon. Well, it turns out it's cut off here on size. In Nuevo Casas Grandes, the moon phase was full. I checked the weather reports, the historical weather reports for Casas Grandes at the time, and they were reported as clear skies with no clouds. And in fact, the sun set at 6:40 p.m. I'm sorry, 6:21 p.m. and the moon rose at 6:40. So at 8 o'clock, there would have been sufficient illumination from a full moon for the pilot to be able to identify the horizon. This is likely what it looked like. This is a full moon. Any of you who have been out here at night, these clear skies, have seen incredible sights. Now this is the problem we first came up with. When we looked for kilometer 282, it was actually 18 kilometers south of here, which would have put it beyond El Ruscio and in fact in the mountains, which was a physical impossibility. What occurred sometime between 1920 and 1930 is that because the railroad had been savaged so repeatedly by the rebels, the signage when it was replaced was reversed, and rather than measure signage north to south, they then identified the signage as south to north. I've been able to identify two resources to confirm that. I have a report from a museum individual sent by the New York Natural History Museum, published in 1905, in which he reports taking a train from El Paso into Ciudad Juarez. As he proceeds south, he gives signage. The signage is all north to south. And in fact, at that time, the train ended just north of here beyond Hacienda de San Diego. I also have historical documents from the lumber mill here in Pearson, where the managers talked about the need to repair bridges during the Revolution. They always gave the signage indicating that it went north to south. If you use those kinds of calculations, Monte Ortiz would have been at 271 kilometers, and 282 would have placed it about 2 miles north of El Ruscio. Now, Walter and I and Pino and a few others have been down there, and there is flat land approximately that distance from El Ruscio. I wondered why the soldier on the train would have said near Pearson. Well, it turns out he hadn't been to El Ruscio yet, and the mill at Pearson was quite impressive. People have forgotten the size of this operation. This is a picture taken off of a postcard, off of a photo that Pino has, of the size of the mill operation here in Monte Ortiz. This is totally gone now. It was destroyed during the war and eventually dismantled. But you can understand why a soldier on a train would have triggered a memory cord near Pearson simply because it was the most impressive town he had been through. This is what the plane looked like. This fuselage is not made of aluminum, it's made of wood. The only metal on this plane is actually the engine. Every other piece was handcrafted of wood made at the Curtis factory in Buffalo, New York. And the wings were wooden struts with canvas backing. And in fact, all of this was completely destroyed by the time the salvage operations started. When I first came down here and asked about this plane wreck, where we might find it, people said, oh, we know where it is. And in fact, on maps, you'll see this little element of the plane. That's up in the mountains. That's actually a plane wreck that occurred back in the 50s. It's well recognized. It's been placed on topographical maps. In most instances, when people told me they knew where the plane wreck was, this is the wreck they were talking about, not the wreck that we were searching for. And in fact, you can see it up here. It is just to the south, east of Puerto Blanca, up in the mountains. Well, these are some of the planes that flew into Mexico. The difficulty with these planes is that they were extremely unstable. One was wrecked on landing on the first attempt in the Colonia Dublin, which left 6 planes in service. These planes were serviced in the field under very crude conditions. You can see here the propeller's been taken off this plane and they're working on the engine. And this is photos taken here in Mexico. But what hasn't changed are the pilots. You take a look at the faces of these pilots. These are aviators from today that lived 90 years ago. The camaraderie is amazing. Arms around one another, smiling, jocular. They were engaged in a very unsafe occupation, but it really didn't seem to bother them very much. This is an interesting photo. I'm sorry. All of these planes ultimately were wrecked here in Mexico. This is amazing. This pilot landed in Chihuahua City, and the Mexicans were very unfriendly. They didn't want the Americans here at the time during the chasing after Villa. But yet, when a photographer was present, all of the people stood back and let the photographer take photos of the pilot on his plane. And then when he stepped away, they utterly destroyed the plane. This man, very respectable photographers. Anyway, what happened to these planes is that they eventually, this is a wreck here in Mexico of one of the JN3s. What happened to these is a list within 4 weeks of arriving in Mexico, none were in operation anymore. Primarily because of the underpowering of the engine, the circumstances in which they were operating, and probably the biggest lesson that U.S. aviation learned with their experience here was that in fact they really needed to significantly improve their aircraft. And in fact, they did. This is a picture of the JN4. When you talk to aviators and they talk about a jetty, they're talking about the JN4 that flew in World War II. And the JN4 was a direct result of the experience that pilots reached here in Mexico based upon the importance of these underpowering of the JN3s. Now, we have still, this is Robert Henry Willis. This is the pilot of the plane that crashed here near Pearson. It's an interesting history. He went on to be a pilot in World War I, very successful career. And at the end of the war, preparing for an inspection, he was cleaning his sidearm. He dropped his weapon, which was still loaded, accidentally killing himself. There is a memorial published online indicating that he's buried in Raymond, France. And so I contacted his grandnephew to learn the location of the gravestone because I thought I would take a photo of it to complete the circle because I was going to France. When I heard from his nephew saying he really wasn't sure that his granduncle was buried in France because he'd just become aware of the fact that a memorial plaque was placed in a cemetery in Willis's hometown of Simpsonville, South Carolina. I've been in touch with the Historical Society in Simpsonville as well as writing to the cemetery with no luck. I'd like to know whether a burial took place or just positioning of a memorial plaque. But this is the gentleman who flew that plane and landed here near Pearson. And for those of you afterwards, please come up and take a look at this rendition. This is a painting that Phil and his wife, Jenny, commissioned from Peter Westacott. He is an aviation artist in England who painted this magnificent picture of the plane wreck near Pearson. And you'll see it tomorrow, this evening, hanging at Phil's house.
On the floor.
Hanging on the floor.
Now, one word about General Pershing, because these connections are interesting. People say, why did Pershing send for these aircraft, knowing that there might be such significant limitations? Pershing was fond of aircrafts. It turns out in 1908, when he was participating in war games in France, he had occasion to actually meet Wilbur Wright, who was also in France consulting for the French government, who were using aircraft designed by him and available in France. It was Pershing who actually realized that the advantages that aircraft might have. At that time, they predominantly were involved in advanced surveillance, looking for forces, relaying messages, and it wasn't until World War II that they began to be engaged in combat in terms of firing on one another. That's the history of a little known part of the world. here in Pearson. The significance is that this is the first loss of an American aircraft on foreign soil, and it happened not far from this little village. What's the question?
Yeah, I've got a question. We know what happened to the aircraft. How did the pilots?
All of the pilots survived. One of them crash landed 2 days later, and he had to walk back to Colonia Dublin, a distance of about 20 kilometers. And it wasn't until 2 days later that they found out that he walked back on a broken leg. But none of the pilots were killed here in Mexico. They were crash landings, injuries, broken legs, broken limbs, but no deaths occurred. Well, when they took off from Columbus, the reports are they held their breath because some of the aircraft cleared the fence at the end of the runway by only several feet. Yes.
In your research, did you find out if Poncho Villa had airplanes?
That's a great question. The answer is yes. Poncho Villa, the rebels did have airplanes. They weren't operative in this part of Mexico, but they were in Naco. He actually hired 2 aircraft with American pilots to fly along the border in Naco, Arizona, and Naco, Mexico. And in fact, Villa was aware of the possibility of using aircraft, but he didn't use them in this part of the world.
Down here, we don't call Poncho Villa a rebel.
El General Visión del Norte. Yeah. Any other questions?
Well, I was amazed by the size of the mill there. 2 questions. Was it just a mill where they ground the ore, or was it a mill and a smelter, and where was it?
This was a lumber mill.